Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Draft Capital here on the Nothing But Net channel on Dash Radio. I'm Stephen Gillespie, and ladies and gentlemen, I have a very special guest today. One of my personal, people that I look up to. I know that he's inspired a lot of people that I know and people who've been on the show before. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chad Ford. Chad, how you doing today?
Good. How are you, Steven? Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh yeah, no problem at all. I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. Just spending the day with the family and things like that. But I'm glad I got a little bit of your time today to ask you some questions about the draft in particular and a few prospects that we're going to be going over. How are you doing?
Great. I'm in Hawaii, so the answer always when you're living in Hawaii is that you're doing great. You
There
you
you go.
just you just say that's you. That's the only acceptable answer.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm over here in sunny Southeast Georgia, where not as pretty as Hawaii, I'm sure, but it's get up to 60 degrees in the middle of January, so I can't be too picky this time of year.
Yeah.
Right on. So, we have a fun show lined up today, and I'm going to ask Chad a few questions about, what in particular makes his draft analysis kind of more unique than some of the other people that do this as well. But before we get going, I just want to remind everyone that support for this show is brought to you by Built Bar. And unlike all the other bars that are out there that taste either like old Play-Doh or a piece of cardboard, when you eat a Built Bar, you will think that you're cheating on your diet with a delicious chocolate dessert. If your kids find out how good these things are, you're going to have to buy more of them. I should know, Chad, I have 4 kids, right? So they're going to be, they typically beg for these things, and they have great flavors like cookies and cream, double chocolate, strawberry, peanut butter brownie, and much more. They also have a mystery flavor that if you guess correctly, you can win a prize. Just go over to their website at built.com, enter in promo code off the ball, and I can get you a 10% discount. And Chad, I know that you're a big fan of the Built Bars too, right?
I am. Coconut's my favorite. I think it tastes like a Mounds bar. Yeah, they're incredible. This is not false advertising. They taste like candy bars. They don't taste like protein bars. They taste like candy bars.
Yeah, and I mean they got a nice nutritional profile as well compared to those candy bars, right? And we have
Yeah.
a guy on our network. His name is Kenneth. I do an NBA show with him. He's preparing for a wedding right now, so he's stashed up on a whole bunch of these built bars to kind of get in game shape, so to speak, here. And he's crazy about them as well.
Yeah, they're delicious.
Right on. So, Chad, now that the bills are paid here, so to speak, I want to ask you a couple draft, kind of general draft questions, right? Because you have a unique advantage in that people come to you and ask you questions and things like that about what you see in players, but you also get feedback from NBA executives, scouts, things
Yeah.
of that nature, to where they think that players are going to be projected. So I want to ask you, what makes it more challenging when you are afforded that information? Because I think that some people would think that that would make their job a lot easier, right, if they know what people are thinking.
Yeah.
But you're in a unique perspective where you're seeing things with your eyes, right? But you're also being told things from other people. So,
Yeah.
kind of what's the challenges that you face whenever you have that additional information?
Yeah, look, my approach has always really been from the beginning to primarily think about the draft as a reporter, right? And so I can watch a ton of games. I do watch a ton of games. I break guys down in synergy. I do pretty much what everybody else does, but when I look out in the league and, there's some 150, 200 NBA scouts who are professionals at this, who have long track records, who are afforded a lot of resources, even that I don't have. I've generally come over the years to trust that the consensus of those guys, and I certainly don't talk to all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but I have my group of scouts and NBA executives that I trust, that I talk to, that there's sort of wisdom in the collective that might sort of exceed the wisdom of any one sort of person. And so, my approach has always been, let me try to get as the best that I can a consensus of these guys and do especially my big board rankings, and then my mock drafts are more team centric. Does the Wizards like as opposed to the Hornets, what have
Sure.
you, as opposed to my own opinion. And I have my own opinion, and so one of the things that's challenging is sometimes I disagree,
Okay.
and and in the draft grades is probably a place where you're going to see my opinion, come out more every year. I also do my own. This is what I would do if I was every team in the league, mock draft once a year for that. But
Hmm.
I think most people have followed me or listened to me over the years because they actually kind of want to know not necessarily what I think, but what is their team likely to do in the draft. And I think the other big challenge is I think when I do that, and I'm trying to put together a consensus, that people misunderstand that consensus isn't unilateral. Everyone believes the same thing, right? So,
Sure.
right now I put Jabari Smith number one based off my conversation with scouts, but there are plenty of scouts that I trust out there that have Chet Holmgren number one, or they have Paulo Banchero at number one. So even though Jabari is one on my board because the majority of the people that I talk to have him there, it doesn't mean that he'll go number one. It doesn't mean that there aren't other very highly educated opinions out there in the NBA that go in a different direction. And then, there's always the personal tug too. Like my favorite player in the draft is Jabari Smith. And so, I was ready to put him there in my December big board. But the consensus wasn't quite there yet from the NBA guys. They just weren't there yet. But in that month between December and January, I think they got there in a big way. And so, that's always a bit of a challenge to balance all of those things.
Yeah, and I would imagine that that'd be the case. And I had the pleasure to go and watch, being stationed down here in Georgia. I took a 4-hour trip up north to Columbia, South Carolina, and I got to watch Auburn play South Carolina. And it kind of stunk a little bit because, I'm like, okay, I'm going to go watch Jabari Smith dominate that game. And, he did okay. He had 10 points, but it was more of like a Walker Kessler showcase. Yeah. So that's always fun. But Chad, I also wanted to ask you, right? Like you have your own talent evaluation that you see. You just spoke on that. You're hearing things from executives throughout the season. You're kind of updating two boards throughout the way, so to speak, right? Like I know that most of the stuff that you put out is more so what you're hearing and seeing from executives, like on your podcast and on NBA Big Board. You're having to do all these things, right? So I could imagine that would be tricky. So balancing those two things, obviously Intel can kind of complicate what you're putting together with your own eyes, but what are the benefits of gaining that additional intel?
Well, I think that there's wisdom in the crowd, and I think there's a lot of research that sort of shows that the more people that you put together on this, the more eyes that are on it, the more likely you're going to get right than just trusting any one particular individual. And, one of the interesting things over the years is I've gotten to know a lot of scouts. Some of them I've worked with for 20 years, and I know their track records probably more than anybody in the league because I take notes on everything that I do. So I know who's traditionally right, who's wrong or whatever. So there's a couple of interesting things. One is that everybody that I know, even the best talent evaluators in the NBA draft, get it wrong all the time.
Sure.
I get it wrong all the time. And so even the best get it wrong all the time. There are some bad talent evaluators in the NBA that I seem to get it wrong most of the time, which is interesting that they still have jobs. But, that's there. So I think one of the advantages is the more people that you put together, the less likely you're going to get it wrong most of the time. But even then, sometimes the entire consensus can be wrong, on a player. But I feel like there's some safety in that. And then I just feel like for readers and listeners, having somebody who can compile all that information together and give it to you is an advantage when you're putting together your own stuff and what have you. And then the other thing that I really like about it is like you said, I do watch games. I'm on Synergy or whatever. And a lot of that for me is so that I know the right questions to ask or how to push back on guys, or when somebody says, I don't like this, I can have a counterpoint based off of analytics or what have you. And then the other thing is just the growing trend towards analytics in the draft means that there's a lot of splits in front offices now. The analytics folks tend to see the draft differently than the more traditional scouts do. And so sometimes if I'm talking to, the John Hollingers of the world, their boards look pretty different than somebody else on their same staff. And, one of the challenges for me is how do I weigh those two very different ways of looking at the draft? And, I think there's a misconception. Guys like John Hollinger scout traditionally as well. They're out at games, they're watching players. They're not just running spreadsheets and what have you. But they are looking at the game differently. And I probably over the years have started to lean more towards that camp, just based off of what I've seen and how accurate they are, as composed to the people that are just going by their gut or their experience or just, what I've sort of seen in the world. I think there's something to the analytics approach. I don't think it's everything. I think it has to be balanced by a lot of things, but I do think it's providing insights and giving teams advantages who are using it and listening to it and weighing it fairly heavily in their draft analysis. And you just look at the Memphis Grizzlies right now, who are on a roll as a team, and how they've put that team together. And they're one of the strongest teams in the league as far as listening to analytics, having it inform who they draft, who they sign in free agency, and even how they play the game. And you look at that team and how that team was put together, and other than Ja and Jaren Jackson, all of those were a lot of those guys were hits in the late first round or early second round, that they had an advantage because I think they were listening to that.
Yeah, for sure. And as you gain, success, you have to get better at scouting, and analytics are just, another set of data points that you can use when breaking down, a player and how you think that they'll fit on your team. And Memphis has done a really good job of getting those later picks and hitting on them, and maybe not focusing so much on age, so to speak, right, with the recent draft pick of Desmond Bane, things of that nature, but putting together a team, listening and fielding from all different angles, whether it just be the kind of what I call the that boy good crowd. Whenever you just watch a guy and that he's, good at basketball, who's a hooper or a gamer, but obviously using outlets like Synergy and stuff as well, putting that together. That's a whole nother part of analysis in of itself. And it's fascinating to hear how people use that and how it influences their draft philosophy. Chad, one of my favorite things that I've been doing in this podcasting community of the NBA draft world is getting to listen to people's draft philosophies. I love that aspect to it. I love to listen how people think and what they find important, because I think everyone inherently has some sort of bias, right? Whenever you're looking at prospects, because, does a player type fit what you value more? Do you think that big should be drafted in the lottery? Things like that. I think that all of that's fun, but Chad, we'll get into some players in particular now. And I think some of these players I'm a little bit higher on than the consensus, so to speak.
Okay.
But I'm curious, because you have the advantage of being able to, converse with front offices, things like that, and you're watching these games too and these players. I'm curious to see what you think and how maybe sort of out of whack I am for valuing these guys as high as I do. The first one I want to ask you a question on is LSU's Tari Eason. Now, he's a 20-year-old sophomore, came over from Cincinnati. 6'8", 216, giving you about 16, 7, and 1. I love his game so much, Chad. I think that he's super strong. There are games where I think that you can point to and say he's strong, but look at this matchup. You know what I mean? But overall, I value his strength. I love his defense. I'm not sure who coined the phrase mugging steals, but I think that he might be leading the nation in those mugging steals where, someone's attacking the basket and he just rips it right out of their hands when they're least expecting it. Yeah. I love his anticipation on that end. Offensively, I don't think that I can convince anyone that 27% shooting from deep is valuable at the next level, right? But I think that almost 80% from the free throw line might be a decent indicator that the touch is present. It just he might need a good developmental staff to help him clean up that shot a little bit. But I love his finishing around the basket. I think his passing ability is a little bit, underrated and under discussed. But I think that defense is going to be his strong calling card. And I think, I have him placed on my latest big board 2.0, 13th on my big board, kind of later end of the lottery, where I think, we have some teams like the Toronto Raptors, who I think are just kind of like cleverly tanking, so to speak. It's not as obvious, but I think that their talent far exceeds where their placement is right now in terms of lottery standings. But they might be looking at a tail end of the lottery draft pick this season. So, Chad, I'm curious, what are scouts and executives, from what you've discussed with, what do they see in Tari Eason, and kind of where is his draft stock presently?
Well, there's a bit of a split on him. He's a unique player, and that is always going to cause teams to evaluate him a little differently. That I'll start with the analytics crowd, because that high block and high steal rate that he has, the combination of those two together, that both of those are high, are really strong indicators of NBA potential for analytics folks. And it's the same sort of combination that pushed Franz Wagner into the high lottery, when I think a lot of people had him in like the 30s kind of coming in
Guilty.
there, and the analytics guys were looking at this and saying, okay, these aren't the same players.
Sure.
And I think that's important to point out. And in this particular case, Wagner was a better shooter, though he was an elite shooter coming out of Michigan, and that opens up his game, and certainly a question for Eason. The other thing about Eason that I think is interesting is he's playing in a system in LSU that's pressing a lot. They put a ton of defensive pressure on other teams. They may be the strongest of any team in the country, frankly, on that. And so he's benefiting from that somewhat. And at times coming off the bench is playing like a small ball center for them. And so there's the more traditional scouts that say, okay, he's benefiting from a system that's allowing him to do certain things, but NBA teams don't particularly play that way.
Right.
And so he's not going to play that way in the NBA. He's probably not quite big enough and strong enough to be a small ball 5 at the next level, which means he's probably more of a 3-4. And so then we start looking at the perimeter shooting. What's that looking like right now? And as you pointed out, at 26%, that there's something there. But you would certainly like it to be a lot better. And then, the other thing that I think is so controversial when it comes to the draft is his age. Yeah. And, some people look at this and say, oh, he's going to be, 21 on draft night. That's so young. That's not that old, but the difference between being 19 on draft night and 21 on draft night are significant. He's a little bit older, for just a tiny bit, older for a sophomore. And so there's an expectation that his numbers should be better, based off of that, especially his shooting numbers. And so I don't think 13's out of the question, because I think it takes the right team. I think you're very savvy, and that he's the type of player that the Toronto Raptors have shown interest in the past. They also already have a ton of players like that. So maybe that's not the direction that they're going to want to go with him. But you're absolutely right in to say, okay, his style of play, the disruptive defensive ability, the ability to defend multiple positions on the floor, his excellent work at the rim, where I think he takes like 62% of his shots and finishes at about like 68%. All of that sort of speaks to, again, a Raptors type player. Whether it's Toronto or not who drafts him, again, I don't know how many of those types of players you can have on their team. I think they drafted like 3 of them in last year's draft, and I think Scotty Barnes is going to turn out to be a pretty good one.
Correct, yeah.
And so it's going to be interesting, because it is going to take a team. He's definitely one of these guys, very specifically, that's going to have a team that's going to be able to maximize his strengths and hide his weaknesses a little bit based off of the system that they're going to play. And so he's definitely going to be one of those guys. Maybe Toronto has him 13 on their board and another team has him 30 on their board, partly because of the style that they play and how they think he's going to fit into the system, because this is just not a guy who's going to fit in every team and every system.
And I think that system conversation can kind of go either way, really, Chad, in my humble opinion, right? Where you can say that, yes, the system that LSU is running, he gambles a lot, but I think that his ability to show that he knows when to correctly read those gambles, more times than not, I think that he makes the correct decision. So I think that if you can look at the way that he processes on the defensive end, and maybe put him more in a traditional half-court style defense, maybe he has a little bit more that he can bring to a team currently constructed that they may not have already. But I definitely do understand, right, where, again, not like how you pointed out, not every NBA team is going to be shooting passing lanes like how he and teammate Alex Fudge. I'm a big Alex Fudge guy as well. I love his activity.
It's crazy that they're bringing both of those guys off the bench.
That should be illegal, Chad. Like, you should not be able to bring both of these guys off the bench while the other team is already sweating.
Yeah. They're Alex Fudge to me is so intriguing as well, and Tari Eason way ahead of Alex Fudge on the defensive end. But I think Alex Fudge is even the more enticing defender because of the elite athleticism and length and shot blocking ability. That he brings to the table. His steal percentage and block percentage. Matisse Thybulle is really it. And Gary Payton II during one season at Oregon State. Those are really the only guys in college basketball ever to do what Alex Fudge is doing, and they did it as juniors and seniors, not as college freshmen. And so he's very intriguing, but the offensive game is a very, very much a work in progress, where at least Tari Eason, getting to the basket, his ability to get to the basket, his finishing ability in transition, all of those things at least point to some offensive impact in addition to the defensive stuff.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And Fudge, I think on my latest big board, I had him 30th, just because I think with defense like that, anybody, a contender would probably look at that and at least entertain the idea. Since then, I put out my 2.0 chat a couple weeks ago. I've scaled him down a little bit, but he's, a high second round pick for me right now. But
I think that's a pretty good gamble, to be honest. He's a young player, and someone just might say, we'll work with him, but defensively he can get out and play right now in the league. And I always think for rookies, that's the harder transition, is being able to stay on the floor defensively, and coaches not wanting you out there as an NBA rookie because they struggle to stay on. They get burned defensively, or, as we know, NBA rookies are notorious for getting in foul trouble almost immediately when they're out there. Yep. And so having a rookie that can actually stay on the floor in the defensive end, I think coaches are going to be more willing to be patient with him on the offensive end.
Yeah, and the fact that, he can have a steal and a block percentage over 5% in the scheme that he did, right? Because I think Matisse, he did it more in a traditional like zone style defense, where he can kind of take a couple step backs and read, while Fudge, on the other hand, is trying to keep his guy ahead of him and still recover. I think that there's a lot of value in what he brings. Yeah. But didn't mean to make this an Alex Fudge podcast, but I'm a big fan. It sounds like you're a fan too, Chad. So no harm, no foul there. Another guy that I'm really big on, Chad, Hugo Besson, French prospect, playing in the NBL now. He's 20 years old, so when he's drafted, he'll be old enough to drink, which is a big no-no, in a lot of draft circles, right? He's playing for the Breakers, as I mentioned. He's 6'3", about 200 pounds, giving you 15 points, 5 rebounds, a little over an assist a game. That assist per game, I think, is a little polarizing because he's playing in the NBL. A lot of people looking at him as a shooting guard, but if you look back over his time in France, he's shown the ability to pass. I just think that the Breakers, with the construct of their roster, especially with the disappointing of like a Ousmane Deng, so to speak, he's asked to be a little bit more of a finisher, and he's showing that he can do that very well. I think a lot of the conversation around him has to be, is he a 1? Is he a 2? I just think that he's a gamer. I think that he can give you minutes at either one of those positions. I'm not saying that he's going to step in and be Goran Dragic, lived up to 100% of that potential, but he kind of gives me those sort of vibes. I know that a lot of people look at Tyler Hero as another comparison for him. I see more of a Goran Dragic when I watch him play. He's a very versatile finisher. He doesn't blow you away with the shooting from deep, but you still have to respect that deep ball. And he can play make, as I mentioned. He's shown it earlier, but his current position, he has to be the finisher on the team now. I'm forgetting the prospect's name, but what's his Zhang Chi that he played against in NBL play is like a 7'4" center that he dunked over a couple of times in preseason basketball. Forgive me for forgetting the name there, but dunking over a 7'4" player at 6'3" is pretty impressive, right? So I have him ranked right now at about 15, 16 in my 2.0. I think that that's probably a little bit more generous from the consensus, but I love his finishing ability. I love his playmaking ability. I think that in the NBA, where it opens up a little bit more, he can take advantage of some of the spacing and could probably run a second unit effectively. Chad, what are some of the things that you're hearing about Hugo Besson?
Well, first, shout out to Rafael Barlow, who before the season pegged Hugo Besson as a first round pick. When I don't necessarily think there was a lot of NBA scouts that were seeing it that way. He was on the radar for sure, but Rafael, who does a great job scouting internationally, was all over him. And through the first 6-7 games that the Breakers have played, he certainly looked the part. I think there's a couple of things that give hesitation from scouts. First of all, because of the COVID restrictions and everything, scouts haven't even gotten over there. They really like to scout guys in person, and because of all the COVID stuff, there's a definite step back for scouts that say, I'm not going to jump on this bandwagon yet. I want to go see him first. I want to see a bigger sample size than than 6 games, though they're liking what they see so far. The second thing is he is undersized and doesn't have potential really great length, right? And so if he's a point guard, probably okay. If you're primarily going to play him off the ball, which I think that's where his strength is right now, is playing off the ball, then you're going to run into some limitations. He's, like you pointed out, he's a good athlete. He's not an Jaden Ivey athlete or anything like that, but he's
right.
He's a good enough athlete to hang in the NBA that way. And so, some of that is going to be, who's he going to defend at the next level? I think that's going to be the biggest question mark about how he earns minutes and stays on the floor. Are teams confident that he's going to be able to defend somebody out there? And then you've got a guy who's a very, very talented and creative scorer. He's fun to watch. When you watch him play basketball, he plays with a chip on his shoulder. He's a really fun player to watch. But as you pointed out, his 3-point shooting is solid. It's not elite. And one of the things that when you start thinking about, okay, they're a little bit undersized, what are they going to bring to the table? You would like that number to be closer to 40 than closer to 30, where it is for Hugo. And so those are the things that we're just going to watch throughout the season with him. Does he get as high as 15? I think there's a chance, because I would say that once we get out of there's 4, maybe 5 guys, and then there's another 5 or 6 guys. And then to me, it's wide open among NBA teams after that group. And so because of that big disparity that's there, I'm not confident saying anybody is not or is like a late lottery pick or first rounder right now. I just think we're too early to work that out. And especially when we've had so many heralded college freshmen who have come in and have not played well so far. And where does the Peyton Watsons and the Caleb Houstons and the Patrick Baldwin Juniors of the world, who have this great rep coming out of high school, but just haven't really shown it on the court yet, where do they end up in this mix? And we saw last year, for example, Zaire Williams, who really struggled, end up still as the 10th pick in the draft, where Brandon Boston Jr., who was also ranked as a top 10 pick before the draft, ends up in the 50s. It's Keon Johnson's, another one. It's really, really hard to peg these young players and how teams are going to approach it. And I'd say right now, for many of them, it's a wait and see type attitude with much of this freshman class. And so how that pans out, who ends up declaring for the draft, all of that puts, to me, a very wide range for Hugo right now and where he ultimately lands. But he's definitely a prospect to watch. And frankly, given how poorly most of the international prospects have played this year, Ishmael Kamagate is probably the only other guy that I would say has played well and improved his stock. That's going to be a plus, because, with all these teams with multiple picks, that being an international player that might be able to hold over for another year or two, there's a lot of benefits sometimes of going that route in the draft. And right now it's hard to make the argument for Yannick Zosa or Ousmane Dieng or others as first round picks.
And that's totally fair. So while we're on the topic of talking international players, it's hard for folks like myself to be able to get a hold of a lot of film and information and things like that. We make best with what we have. I want to ask you, as far as the evaluation process, from what you hear from NBA executives, how much more difficult is it for NBA front offices to really feel like they have as good of a finger on the pulse for these international prospects as opposed to our domestic players that we watch?
When I first started in the early 2000s, there was teams that didn't have international scouts, period. They subscribed to an international scouting service run by a couple of brothers, and they would sort of get consulted, but almost every team sort of did that. And then there was a handful of teams that were actually having international scouts. In fact, probably I started to make a name for myself by going over and embedding with some of those scouts. And that was the sort of first reporting that came out of Nicolas Gitsavili. And then later the next year, Darko Milicic and Michael Pietris and Boris Jow and a number of other players that were in that draft. And it was sort of the Wild West. There was a group of 5, 6, 7 international scouts that kind of went around and did this. Nowadays, teams have multiple international scouts. They often have them regionally based. So they're coming from those areas of Europe or the Balkans or what have you. Those are feeding in. General managers are now routinely, except for maybe during COVID, routinely going over there and they have people on the ground that can take them around and help them into those things. They build relationships with teams. They can get into practices. It's dramatically changed over the years, and less reliant on camps and more reliant now on going in and seeing this. So I would say that most NBA teams now will tell you that they feel that they have just as good a handle on the international prospects as they do the American prospects and what have you, with the occasional challenge of a player that's getting stashed by a team internationally, and they're being difficult with teams about letting them into practices and things like that. I mean, that happens occasionally, but I think for the most part, I would say that everybody's pretty confident, and even the analytics crew has done a really good job, both with the NBL in Australia, as well as with the EuroLeague for sure, and the ACB in Spain and what have you, of figuring out basically statistical translations for those groups that then they can kind of compare apples to apples when they get in with players playing college basketball. I think they're still working on the G League stuff. I think because that's so new, there's not a lot of history.
I can only imagine what OTE looks like for them right now.
Yeah, and I think OTE is a total throw your hands up in the air and say we from an analytics standpoint, we don't really have a lot to tell you right now about this. And yeah, OTE is going to be challenging, but I just don't think it's the mystery anymore. And then I think for the average fan, following Rafael Barlow, who's living in Paris right now, cutting video and just doing dispatches over there every day, is probably your single best source on the internet for just publicly available information about what's happening with these international prospects.
Yeah, I follow Rafael Barlow myself. I've had the fortune and pleasure to have him on the show the previous cycle. And because of him, he turned me on to Hugo Besson. And he was my favorite international prospect coming into the season over the likes of, Nikola Jovic and, Roko Perkison as well. So, Chad, we'll transition now here to another domestic product coming out of Stanford, that being Harrison Ingram, who recently just had a very good game. 19-year-old freshman, again, playing for Stanford. He's about 6'8", 230, averaging close to, 12 points per game, 7 rebounds, 3 assists. I'm curious to see what execs are saying of him. I know that the popular comparison is Slow-Mo playing for Memphis right now, but I think that he's a little bit more slippery than Slow-Mo. I think the vertical athleticism is a little bit better. But where he draws these comparisons are his playmaking, his defense. I think the 3-ball, kind of like Hugo, it's not sexy, right? But it's respectable. He's kind of polarizing for me. I have him graded out a little bit later in the teens on my 2.0 on my board right now. He's working his way a little bit more closer to that lottery, trying to avoid like the power ranking philosophy that I know that you speak on sometimes. Overall, though, I think that the youth, the size, the instinctual feel that he has in the game, I'm a big fan of instinctual players, guys who steer away from having that academy brain. They're just kind of born with it, feel the game moving around them. I love that. He would be so much better, right, Chad, if he was, a little bit more athletic, I think is what people would want to see from him. But I think that overall he's got enough of a skill set there to where at the next level, if a team in the late teens, early 20s, even later on in the first round, I don't know if he'll be available there now. I think that there's enough for, a team to work with the game that he has currently. What are some of the executives and, the folks that you're talking to saying about Harrison Ingram?
Scouts have been hesitant for a couple of reasons. Stanford's been shut down quite a bit because of COVID, so the sample size is a little bit smaller. I think they really want to see him in Pac-12 play, in part because you're going to see him with better athletes and see how all of this gels together. You pointed out he had a great game the other night, but then he followed it up with a 4-pointer, right? And this has been one of the issues with Harrison Ingram. It depends on the night you see him. There's nights that he absolutely looks like he could end up being drafted in the late lottery, mid-first round. And there's nights where you feel like, man, this is not going to, not going to quite translate the way that we thought yet. I agree with you on a couple of things. As far as feel for the game goes, he's a top 5-6 prospect in this draft. And he's got great size for his position. And so those are the things he's got going for him. He's not just like saying, well, he's not an elite athlete. He's not a very good athlete. He's slow laterally. I think defensively, again, we talk about it offensively, and his basketball IQ allows him to get to certain places on the floor, and his feel for the game can sort of compensate to a certain extent. But can it compensate on the defensive end, or is he going to have to kind of use his strength to essentially try to guard fours in the NBA, right? Like that might be, again, where teams are sort of figuring him out right now. And the shot comes and goes, right? And so it's the same thing again about he's not a bad shooter, but he's not an elite shooter. And I think he's just a guy that teams are trying to figure out. I think this is a great example too of coming into this draft, playing at Stanford. Scouts thought he was going to be a two-year guy at least at Stanford, and now it's looking like he might not be. And so you start building these scouting regiments early in November and December, based off of the guys that you think are going to be one and dones, and obviously seniors and other people that you think are most likely going to be in the draft. And then some of these players start to pop in other ways that look like, okay, there also might be here early. And some of the guys, again, like we talked about, Caleb Houston or whatever, just who we thought were going to be one and dones for sure.
Right.
Man, maybe they're not ready. And so I think with Harrison Ingram, where I sort of land on this is, I think by March, we'll start to have a feel, because he'll end up getting heavily scouted when they play UCLA, when they play Arizona, when they play USC, right? And they're going to want to see him in those environments. And does he have the ability to use all of those skills to overcome some of his weaknesses? And if the answer is yes, with no question, he could end up being a pick in the late lottery to mid first round. If the answer is no, I still think a team takes a flyer on him, probably, somewhere in the 30s or 40s.
And I think that's fair. So I think what we're seeing in the NBA now, Chad, is guys who have tremendous feel for the game, like a Harrison Ingram. He at 6'8", I think that people tend to like to pair passing ability and size. I mean, look at what we're seeing with Josh Giddey. And not saying that Harrison Ingram has the same level of feel and passing ability as a Josh Giddey, but I think that the height kind of covers up a little bit for some of the weaknesses, right? Because as good as Josh Giddey is, a lot of people were really confident in his ability in transitioning from the NBL over to the NBA. Even still, I feel like that height kind of covered up a little bit for some of the blemishes in his game that some people had. Are people really discussing that at all, as maybe utilizing him as a point forward of sorts? Or
I think they're trying to figure out what he is, right?
Yeah.
The thing I would say about Josh Giddey is Giddey, while not an elite athlete, is a significantly better athlete than Harrison Ingram is.
Sure.
And that's going to sort of make a difference. The other thing about Josh Giddey that I would say is he plays with a swagger and a chip that we saw in Australia, and it's absolutely translated to the NBA.
Yes.
Where whether he is or isn't, he thinks he's the best player on the floor every night. Where Harrison Ingram, you're seeing that confidence sort of wax and wane, and his ability to sort of take over games. He's done it, and he's had some big games where he's taken over in the fourth quarter, but again, seeing that sort of consistently there. But you're right about a couple things with Giddy. We questioned Giddy's defensive abilities in the NBA, who he's going to defend. We questioned whether his shot was going to be good enough. And the thing was with Giddy, though, I will say this, Giddy is an elite passer.
Yes.
Like to me, an elite passer, maybe not quite LaMelo Ball, but just a kind of a step below like LaMelo Ball, where Harrison Ingram's a good passer for a 6'8" guy, a guy who really sees the floor, but I don't see that elite passing ability there yet. And so, all of those things come down to kind of one of my mantras in the NBA draft, which is there one skill that you have that would make you elite at that skill that you can just hang your hat on at the NBA. And I think we knew for Josh Giddy that would be passing. It was elite enough that even though he had some significant weaknesses, this could keep him in the NBA a long time. And then you hope that some of the other weaknesses sort of refine out, right? But is there one thing you can hang your hat on? And the guys that I've missed on the most in the draft consistently have been guys that have good skills or all around skills or I call them toolsy players, but none of their tools are elite. Those are the guys that often end up kind of washing out of the draft because they can't find an identity for themselves. There's not that one thing that they do particularly well. And then look, superstars do multiple things at an elite level. And that's why we have them, ranked so high. And so I'm still waiting with Harrison Ingram. You can say size good, feel for the game good for his size. Is it elite? Maybe his feel is probably closest thing that we have to elite, but you want to see that paired with a particular skill that I'm confident that he's going to be able to replicate and do in the NBA. And I think that's very possible with him, but I'm not as confident on him as I was with like a Josh Giddy and what that skill was going to be.
Yeah, that's totally fair. So, Chad, we'll transition now to the last prospect that I have on the docket today to discuss. A guy who I've reached out to several people whose opinions I respect and value, and they have a draftable grade on him. Some people even have, high second to, at the highest I've seen, like late first round conversation on him. That being Michael Devoe, the senior out of Georgia Tech, 22-year-old lefty, 6'5", 191 pounds, averaging 21 points per game, close to 5 rebounds, 3 assists against consistently good competition. I mean, Georgia Tech has played some really strong teams this season, and Michael Devoe has led them throughout a lot of those games, right? I think obviously the fact that he's a senior and he's had multiple chances to come into the draft is going to kind of work against him. Not necessarily the strongest player, but I think that he's also not fearful. I think that he can play 1 or 2, and I think his all-around game, right? Like he's wired to score. He can pass pretty decently as well. I'm curious to see like what has past conversation of Michael Devoe looked like, and maybe even compared to now, has it differed at all, or kind of what you're seeing is more of the same from him over the previous couple seasons?
One of the hardest things to get our arms around is what happens when a guy pops as a senior, but doesn't necessarily pop before that. Ochai Agbaji is sort of in that same category right now for Kansas, right? He's always been solid at Kansas. He actually declared for the draft last year. Agbaji did, and didn't really get much interest at all, decided to come back to school wisely at Kansas. And then, KU becomes his team as a senior, and he steps up. He shoots his highest percentage from 3 that he's done his whole career. He's now a 20-point-a-night scorer. And what do you do with that, right? Because you're comparing him to guys who are playing their first 10, 12 games of college basketball, not their 150th game. The difference between an 18-year-old and a 22-year-old is significant. And is it the case that this player just developed and was a late bloomer, is getting there? Or is this the case of someone who's benefiting from the fact that they're 3 to 4 years older than the other players, that they are the default captains of their teams because of their age and because of a lack of other talent on the team. And so they're the go-to guy by default. And, at Kansas this year, that's a great sort of example. They don't have a lot of NBA talent on this team this year, which means you don't have a super freshman or sophomore that's sort of coming in there that's going to steal that limelight. And Georgia Tech, I would say the same thing about. He's the only NBA prospect, on that team. But, one thing I will say about Devoe, consistently, he's a 41% career 3-point shooter.
Yep.
And so one thing that you can say about him is he's consistently shot the ball from deep, not with elite volume, but with a fairly high volume. And then the other thing that I'll say about Devoe is that he's not just a catch and shoot guy. He can also shoot off the bounce, which is very attractive to NBA teams, right? It's one thing to be able to stand in the corner and sink corner threes, but a lot of his threes are unassisted. He's creating his own shot off the bounce and hitting those threes. And those are going to be the things that if he gets drafted in the late first or early second round, That's going to be the thing that he's going to hang his hat on. He's a solid athlete, but not like the most explosive athlete in the world. He can play a little point, but I'm not sure that anybody's drafting him thinking, hey, this guy's going to be the point guard of the future. He does get after it defensively, but he's not an elite defender. He doesn't have elite strength for his position, but he really shoots the ball well, and then does enough other stuff around that to not just make him a one-dimensional player. As a shooter. And so could he sneak into the late first? I have him as a second round grade right now. I just actually did a column. Well. I did a column on, seniors that might sneak into the first round, and he didn't quite make that cut. He was in the conversation for sure, but he didn't quite make the cut of the guys that I think are the most likely to sneak in there. But those are always, to me, the harder evals, because it's, you've got the Dick Vitales of the world and college. This guy's a senior and he's, blowing up, and, why are teams not, jumping on this guy who's averaging 20 points a game, but they're 22 years old, and it's just not apples to apples with someone who's doing it at 18.
Yeah. And you spoke that you have a second round grade on him. I have him flirting with kind of that 35 to, 40 camp right now. And I think that that's pretty fair and reasonable. But the reason I wanted to discuss him today, Chad, is because I hear a lot of discussion of other players that kind of fare in that same range. Yeah. And I don't really hear Michael Devoe getting discussed a lot. So I figured he would be a fun player to bring up with you to see what other, camps and parties we're thinking about him and his draft stock right now. So, Chad, that was all the players that I had on the docket to discuss with you today. I appreciate you giving me the insight that you have, and how you're personally watching them as well. Before we let you go, I wanted to ask you just real quick, for kind of an advice question here, for folks like myself, for people who are listening, who, maybe kind of, concerned or worried, how am I supposed to evaluate prospects and things like that? Just sort of, what advice would you give somebody when they're evaluating talent?
Well, I had two advantages that I think are a little bit harder in today's day and age than mine, which was that, I went as a young reporter. I didn't start at ESPN. I started with my own website. I started independently, just like, but I went out to all of these NBA draft camps, Portsmouth, the NBA draft combine. And back when it was covering the draft was a much less crowded field, just to be honest. Right. Sure. And I started just asking scouts, can I sit with you through a game, and can we just talk during the game? And can you teach me what you're looking for? Can you share with me your scouting report so I can see what you're seeing? Because, for me, I needed to learn how to see the game like an NBA scout saw the game, not necessarily how Chad Ford saw the game. Right. And so some of that, I just have to think for years of asking for those favors, right? Can I sit with you for a game? Could you share scouting reports with me? Can I have a conversation? I don't see this. Why is this guy this way? And so I think, getting mentoring and not being afraid to ask for it. You might not get it from a general manager, but there's a lot of scouts in the league, and some of them are younger scouts in the league, and a lot of them don't mind, talking to people and what have you. The second thing was that I think everybody has their niche, and you need to sort of find your niche. If we're going to listen to Steven, what is the angle that you're bringing to the draft that might be different than everybody else that's out there, other than this is just your opinion about players. And, for me early on, I sort of recognized, like, I think I'm an okay scout. And, I think if I look at my own personal list compared to other guys over time, they've gotten pretty good. But I decided I was going to lean on that reporting aspect of it, and really try to gather information and intel together. And that's my shtick. And there's other people that are doing, very intense video breakdowns on synergies and writing 20,000 words on one prospect, based off of, tracking every possession that they've had during the season. And so there's a lot of different angles to it. And I just think that, you want to figure out what's yours and what does your voice sort of add, to the draft. But I will say this, I love this young generation that's coming up of NBA draft Twitter, that I think you all refer yourself as.
Right.
It exists back in my day. I think one thing that's cool is you all seem to be really supportive of each other instead of being competitive with each other, and you're all synergizing and working together. And I think you're building something that I think is going to be really powerful. And so I think that's the other thing, is just keep being collaborative. Don't pit yourself against other people. Be collaborative. Learn from all these other folks that are out there. Incorporate that into your analysis. Don't be shy about bringing your voice to the table. And the other thing is, I was joking with a friend Fischilla, who was on my podcast the other day. He's always like, the mock drafts. Don't pay attention to the mock drafts. I really build your board. Don't look at them. One of the interesting things was that Danny Ainge, who was the head of the Celtics, one time told me, I ban all of my scouts from reading any mock drafts. And he says it's just too powerful. Even though some of these mock drafts, they don't even know who's putting this together. This could be a dude in their basement. They don't even know, but when they see it and they see a ranking on a guy and it looks different than their own, they immediately start to question themselves and whatever. And Danny told me, he tried to emphasize with all of his scouts, I don't care what the consensus is out there. I don't care what other people think. I want to know what you think. And so don't be shy about, if you've got Tari Eason and you're confident he's at 13, leave him at 13. Don't drop him to 25 because you're looking out there and the consensus at ESPN and the Ringer and everything else, or my board or whatever, says that it's something else. Stick with what you feel, and you'll make mistakes, but don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's okay as well. And, my good friend Kevin O'Connor at the Ringer, who I watched from a very young guy putting together a little draft guide that he did every year to being the lead draft analyst, for the Ringer. 2 years ago, he put Killian Hayes number one on his board, and stuck with it all year. Right. And people kill him because Killian Hayes has, not turned out the way that we had hoped. But by the way, I had him like 6th or 7th. So it wasn't like I thought he was.
Yeah, I had him like 9th, I think. Right.
Yeah. I mean, anybody had him ranked in the top 10 was saying they thought Killian Hayes was going to be a player and not the guy that we've seen at Detroit so far. But he was bold enough to do that. And, I know he took some hits, but for me, that actually makes me want to follow and listen to Kevin O'Connor more, because I know that everybody's going to get things wrong, but he had the courage to kind of march to the beat of his own drummer of what he saw. And that makes me want to listen to him and follow along. And by the way, Kevin O'Connor's gotten a lot of stuff right over the years. I followed him for a long time. He's a really good draft analyst. And so just follow wherever your data and your process is leading, and just completely ignore that other stuff that's out there. Not because you're disrespecting it, but just because you're going to follow your own process, and that's what matters.
Yeah, and that's fair. And Chad, thank you so much for providing that insight there at the end of the conversation. I've had so much fun having you on the show today, Chad. This is, a check off the bucket list for me. I've been listening and following you for a long time. I affectionately refer to you as kind of an OG in the community. I'm sure that you get that a lot, but you're a strong pillar. A lot of people look up to you, and for you to be able to come on Draft Capital today, it means a lot to me. And I know that I have a lot of people that I work with and talk with too. They're super excited just to hear you and I, talk and go over these prospects. So again, thank you so much for coming on the show. Before we let you go, I would just love for you to be able to, plug yourself and some of the projects that you have going on.
Yeah, I've got a Substack newsletter over at NBABigBoard.com, published several times a week. And when it gets closer to the draft, it kind of goes up to every day. You'll get big boards, mock drafts, scouting reports, everything over there. And then I have my own podcast by the same name, Chad Ford's NBA Big Board, over on the Locked On Podcast Network. And we do a podcast every Friday. Sometimes I'm solo. Sometimes I have guests. Fran Fraschilla on this week. John Hollinger on this a lot. Rafael Barlow comes on a lot. Yeah. Tony Jones, really great guests. And we try to cover all things NBA draft. So would love for you to subscribe and check those out.
Yeah, myself, for all my viewers and listeners, I subscribe. So I would highly encourage all of you guys to do the same as well. A lot of good information for folks like myself who don't have the ear of NBA front offices and scouts and stuff like that. Chad is our inside guy. He's the one that goes and talks to these guys, and he tells us everything that he knows, and that's highly valuable information. So for myself, if you want to follow me on Twitter, that's where I'm most active. You can follow me at Stephen G. Hoops. I'm a part of the Off the Ball Network. You can go to Substack and look up Off the Ball Network, or just type in offtheballnetwork.substack.com. For all of your sports needs. We don't just talk college hoops. We talk, NBA, we talk NFL, college football. We have a betting thread on there too, where our guys are producing heaters on there as well. You can follow me myself individually on Substack at stephengillespie.substack.com, where I have both of my big boards. I write a little bit as well. And, anywhere that podcasts are available, just go look up Draft Capital, like, share, subscribe, rate, and review, all of that fun stuff. It helps out a lot. So for my tremendous special guest today, Mr. Chad Ford, for myself, for the Off the Ball Network, the fine folks at Built Bar, and on the the Nothing But Net channel on Dash Radio, this has been Draft Capital. We'll catch up with y'all next time.